Hello, I'm Florencia Bassano, Assistant Curator of Latin American Art at the Blanton Museum of Art, here at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome to our series, Curated Conversations. Before we start, just a few notes. A live transcript of this talk is available if you click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Your audio is muted, and so no one can hear you. Only the panelists are visible on the screen. We'll be taking your questions from the Q&A window. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, including one labeled Q&A. Click on that to type and send your questions. Tonight's talk is being recorded and will be available to watch on the Blanton YouTube channel next week. Now, let's begin. Tonight's topic conversation is Caminos del Rio Grande, Luis Jiménez's Borderlands art. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce the two distinguished scholars who will speak about Luis Jiménez's work. Barnet-Sanchez is an associate professor emerita of Latin American and Chicano-Chicana, Latino-Latino art history at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, where she was also Associate Dean for Student Affairs for the College of Fine Arts. During the early 1990s, Dr. Barnet-Sanchez was a curator at the Mexican Museum in San Francisco. And she has participated in some of the most significant exhibitions in the field, including Chicano Art, Resistance and Affirmation, 1965 to 1985 at UCLA, and just another poster, Chicano Graphics Art in California. Dr. Barnet-Sanchez has an extensive list of important publications, including Signs from the Heart, California Chicano Murals with Eva Cockcroft, and Give Me Life, Iconography and Identity in East LA Murals with Tim Drescher. At present, she serves as a member of the Board of Directors of the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. John Morán González is the J. Frank W. Regents Professor of American and English Literature at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the former director of the Center for Mexican American Studies here at UT. He has a long list of distinguished publications, including his books, Border Renaissance, the Texas Centennial and the Emergence of Mexican American Literature, as well as The Troubled Union, Expansionist Imperatives in Post-Reconstruction American Novels. His co-edited publications include The Cambridge History of Latino American Literature with Laura Thomas, and the anthology Reverberations of Racial Violence, Critical Reflections on the History of the Border with Sonia Hernandez. In addition, Dr. Morán González is a founding member of Refusing to Forget, an award-winning public history project dedicated to critically memorializing state violence in the South Texas borderlands from 1910 to 1920. Dr. Morán González currently serves on the board of directors for both Humanity Texas and also for Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project. Welcome, Holly and John. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight's program takes place, and I'm going to share my screen. Tonight's program takes place in the context of the exhibition Border Vision, Luis Jiménez's Southwest at the Blanton Museum of Art. On the screen, you can see one of those wonderful panoramic views that you can take with your cell phone, showing the two galleries that feature a selection of works by Luis Jiménez that refers to his experiences in the Southwest, where he lived most of his life. Luis Jiménez was born in El Paso, Texas in 1940, where he grew up working in his father's electric and neon lights sign shop. During the early 1960s, he studied architecture and art at the University of Texas at Austin, so he's a fellow alumni. After he graduated, he spent a short time in Mexico City, but he was really in New York in the late 1960s, where he emerged as an artist. After he decided he wanted to explore Southwestern themes, he came back west in the early 1970s, settling in New Mexico, where he lived until his untimely death in 2006. Holly and John, let's begin your conversation on Luis Jiménez and his vision of the Southwest. I know you were both interested in the relations between him and fellow El Paso artist Tom Lee, whose work Jiménez saw as a child. Here's that slide.
Well, thank you, Flor. Delighted to be here to talk about Luis Jiménez in context. And really that context is both in terms of history and art history. And I think these visual texts here really give us a good contrast in the kind of narratives that each of these artists were creating. So Tom Lee, of course, is quite well known as a Southwestern artist, but really the narrative he is creating is of the Southwest per se, right? Not Mexico's north, but the United States Southwest. And so what's remarkable about his 1938 piece here, Paso the North, is, of course, the utter lack of conflict between the historical figures. In fact, it is up to the viewer to determine that the Spanish conquistador and the native peoples depicted are not really the same era as, say, the lawman on the right. And so there's a narrative here of the inevitability of the United States that apparently is free of conflict. And I think here's the difference that Luis Jiménez introduces in his work, because as Holly and I will talk through in this tonight, Luis Jiménez's work is all about conflict, and particularly conflict between people, between cultures, and with the environment, but most fundamentally over the idea of progress. And I'll just kind of mention something about progress as an idea, animating both the manifest destiny of the United States that Tom Lee depicts and the critique of it that Luis Jiménez depicts. Because, of course, progress in the form of manifest destiny, that is the idea the United States had the God-given right to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, was the idea of progress. And it was a deeply racialized idea of progress, meaning that essentially white settlers had the right, knew best how to exploit the land, the gift of the lands that were given, and therefore had the right to displace native peoples or Mexican people who just happened to be there first. And so that is the idea of progress is really what's at stake here. And I'll turn it over to Holly to talk about how it manifests itself in the Progress Suite.
Holly, you turn on the microphone, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Flor, and for this opportunity to have this conversation and to talk about Luis and to look at his work. Yes, conflict. Luis worked a great deal with the idea of progress, and progress is highly ironic in all of his work. And I don't know if people watching can see, but in the clouds of each of these lithographs are the letters that spell out progress across all four of them. And what you are seeing, the juxtaposition of a very active and intense indigenous person on a horse going after a bison, which I grew up calling a buffalo, is profoundly different than the very quiet depiction of the Apache Indians in the Tom Lee work. And we could do a one-to-one on that. But I think it's just important as you look at this through time, this suite of going from the indigenous person who knows no borders to the vaquero who comes from Mexico, who also knows no borders, to the sort of the Wells Fargo wagon, to the flashy car, to the railroad train, to the airplane. Does this, in fact, represent progress? And that is the question. And I would say Luis is answering in the negative. And I think if we look at the next engagement with progress, we will see that as well. If I may start on this, John, we see the first lithograph in the progress suite of the hunter, and you also see his very large piece, Progress 1 from 1974, some of his early work using fiberglass and basically airplane paint. But what you are seeing is something that embodies one of the important things about Luis's work, which is ambiguity. Is this an exhausted Indian who has come to the end of the hunt? Or is this a dead Indian on top of a dead coyote, on top of a dead bison, with the remnants of nature, a snake, a rabbit? Is this essentially the end of the road for this way of life? And one can see it in a couple of different ways. Any thoughts, John?
Yes, for me, I think this is one where Jimenez picks up on the idea of progress through advances in modes of transportation, and in particular here is the horse, which was introduced by Spanish settlers, but which the indigenous peoples of the region made their own, right? And so, and really the one here is of, yes, there is conflict in the sense that it is a hunt. It's a scene of predation, right? Of predator and prey, so to speak, which is a repeated motif throughout Jimenez's work. On the other hand, it is really, for me, quite intimate, right? The kind of intermingling of bodies here in a way that I think it takes on a very different kind of valence in the other progress works.
Yes, there's a great deal of silence here. There isn't the same kind of sense of extreme action that you see in many of his other pieces. I think maybe if we contrast this with Progress 2, we will be able to see that kind of contrast.
So I'll go ahead and just quickly comment on this, because this is a remarkable sculpture. This is absolutely, you absolutely have to see it in person to appreciate the kind of three-dimensionality of it. And I mean, I'm the pieces are poised or counterpoised in such a way that they're perfectly balanced, but I am also very afraid of going underneath any of either the horse and rider or the longhorn. But here is that kind of quintessential Southwestern theme, except it's Mexican, because of course, ranching society started off as Mexican. Mexicans developed ranching, which was then adopted by cowboys. But here, the kind of question of predation and prey is ambiguous, because There's no clear sense. Sure, there's a lasso on the Longhorn for a cattle drive, but here that kind of sense of frenetic, the situation's becoming frenetic, right? That the vaquero is barely in control of his steed, and in fact of his hat. It's threatening to kind of fall off. And so this is less about kind of purported control, right, over nature than just barely hanging on in some way. And so that kind of conflict, this idea of chaos and potential disaster even, is kind of implied in this work, Holly.
Well, I agree. And I think there is no sense that the vaquero and the horse are going to control and corral the Longhorn. That the outcome is not inevitable. And I think in the piece we just saw of Progress 1, the outcome was inevitable. So here you have, once again, that ambiguity. And with the idea of the predator and the prey can get away. On all those National Geographic shows, there are lots of images of rabbits getting away from coyotes to live another day. And this is possible, but what you have is the strain of the sinews and the bones and the skin, and the fact that the horse and the steer, the Longhorn, are shades of the same color, reminds us that actually they are kin to each other in some very real way, in a way that the vaquero is an interloper in that natural. And if we look at the next image of the detail of the ground of this piece, and I think one of the most striking things is this is a very small ground. And as you say, it's a very large piece, and wandering around underneath it is intimidating. But we can see the details that he presents of the ongoing nature of predator-prey. If you look at the owl actually has a mouse, and that it has captured and killed. And there's another mouse, if you look at the left side photograph, that's kind of hanging out and going, oh my goodness. And then you have a skull. And this is a skull that indicates death. It's not the Dia de los Muertos kind of activated skull. This is a seriously dead skull. And even the cactus looks a little on the wonky side there. So you get a sense of that the ground itself is a battleground, even though it is very small in this particular depiction.
What is also remarkable, just quickly to add, this is one of those. The photo does not do this piece justice at all, and including looking at the base, there is an incredible amount of detail, like literally a half dozen to a dozen other animals that you cannot possibly spot here in this photo. The detail is amazing. And so, but it does kind of speak once again to that kind of element of progress, right? The progress of time, the progress of modes of transportation, and of course, the idea of progress with a capital P, that is the march of civilization, right, itself. All of these things, I think, come into increasing question as we move on to the other parts of the progress suite.
And we can let's see, if you move on, we are going to, this is moving away from the progress suite to the actual issue of the border and crossing it. Could we just go back for a second? Looking at the detail, looking at the land, we are thinking about, when we think about the Southwest and we think of Luis Jimenez's Southwest, we are thinking of Texas and New Mexico and the border and the borderlands. And in many ways, the territory of Texas is very different than the territory of New Mexico, but there are many things in common as well, which speaks not only to the issue of progress, but to the issue of the borderlands and where are those borders, and to nature specifically, borders are insignificant. And so there is a lot of shared commonality that we see in the land and in the idea of mountains and desert together, which you see both in New Mexico and in West Texas. We should probably go forward, I think, to everybody should see this exhibition if they can, to this piece. There are many photographs of this piece. There are photos of this border crossing or border crossers in the landscape, even though if you look at it carefully, this is a family crossing through water. So this is crossing the border from Mexico into Texas. And this is really an homage to Luis's father specifically. And it's a monolith. It shows endurance. It shows perseverance. And what is great about the installation, wherever it is, it's also in MacArthur Park in Los Angeles, that when you walk around it, you get the sense of motion. This is, while from the front, it looks solid and quiet. You walk around it and there is motion, but it is stolid, it is careful, it is quiet. They are crossing in the night, probably. They're trying to be very quiet. And if you can see the detail, the one detail of the baby that the mother is holding, the hands are splayed and that baby is screaming. So that you're getting the weight of what they are trying to accomplish. And this would have been done in the 20s and 30s. So this is a long time ago. It's a different border crossing than we experience now. John.
Well, Holly, this, in fact, I believe the base is marked 1922. So basically a century ago. And really, this speaks to the kind of conditions of what the border meant, what crossing the border meant at that era. Of course, this is in the wake of the Mexican Revolution, when nearly 1 million Mexicans fled to the United States as war refugees, mainly to California and Texas. And here, Luis Jimenez is depicting his, this is not his father per se, but
no, not literally, no.
Yeah, but the figuratively, that collective experience. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that really prior to 1924, the border was not meant to exclude people. There were different types of regulations, mostly around health, but the main concern of the United States was around customs, right? Was around the importation of goods and being able to tax those. People, not so much. Now that changed with the 1924 Immigration Act, which created what we now know as the kind of border security regime that, as we understand it, and crossing the border became a very different experience. Just very quickly, for most of the 20th century, though, the border was less about exclusion, right? The complete exclusion of undocumented migration, but rather more about regulation of a badly needed labor supply. So in other words, when the economy in the US was good, there was relatively lax kind of enforcement. Conversely, when the economy turned sour, then there were stepped up deportations. But for the most part, the border was not about exclusion as it was about regulation. This, of course, would change in the 1990s, and we can talk about that. But for the moment, I'll just kind of also mention this is a huge piece, right? It's over 10 feet tall, absolutely monumental. But really a monument to Jimenez's monument to the people who made this crossing, right, in that era. And whereas we're used to seeing perhaps monuments of this stature to great, people we deem great, in bronze or marble, perhaps, but to have these folks, everyday folks, depicted on this scale in fiberglass is really Jimenez's kind of tribute to them.
Well, yes, very definitely. And it's a tribute to the fact that ordinary people deserve monumental remembrances because of what they have accomplished. And whether they be farmers or steel workers or border crossers. And so that he is also, I believe, saying that universal art can find its place by focusing on people who don't look like what has been traditionally called universal, i.e. in the West, Anglo-European phenotypes, and that the universal can stem from many different types of human experience. And I think that's very important.
We have a question from Cara Foster. He asks, the title is different in English and Spanish. Was that intentional on the artist's part, border crossing versus cruzando el Río Bravo?
Literally, I can't, factually, I don't know. My guess is it is.
My own take on it is that really the one in Spanish is, of course, from the perspective of the migrants themselves, right? They're cruzando, that is crossing el Rio Bravo, which is, of course, the name in Spanish of the Rio Grande. So that is, I think that is part of what Jimenez is trying to do here, right? Depict this experience through their eyes, from their perspective. And so that's whereas border crossing seems neutral, or, these days in many circles, that's quite not neutral, but nonetheless, I think he wants to depict it from their eyes.
And I also think when you are crossing the river, you are crossing the river, and there may be an implication that that's a border between two nations, but it's not automatic. They are crossing a river to get from one side to the other. From a US perspective, they're crossing a border. and here is the border. And what is interesting is seeing that the Rio Bravo or the Rio Grande encompasses the entire Texas-Mexico border and virtually none of New Mexico.
Well, Holly, it's remarkable because the experience of the Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo, is so different, precisely because it is a border in Texas and is not in New Mexico or even Colorado, right? And so experiencing the meaning of the river, it just takes on very, very different valences. And indeed, one friend of mine from New Mexico jokes that New Mexico is not a border state, right? In the sense that the border experience does not define New Mexico in the same way as it does the Texas borderlands.
Yeah, there are all sorts of conversations, snarky comments, and other things about border regions and about Texas versus New Mexico, and about water and water rights. But it gives you a sense of how enormous the Rio Grande is and how without water it exists right now. But this gives us a sense. And right in the corner as well, between New Mexico, the Rio Grande, and in Texas, that is where El Paso is. And so El Paso is right next to Juarez, and it's right next to New Mexico. So this is all very close in terms of Luis's own experience.
So here is a, let's see, it's a drawing from that is not featured in the exhibition, but we decided to put it here in order to provide a contrast that Jimenez came to see between the experience of cruzando el Rio Bravo in the 20th century, for most of it at least, and then what was increasingly the case during the 1990s onward to, I think, our present moment. That is one of increasing danger, surveillance, and indeed predation. And we see the theme of predation where the drones and the helicopters are the sizes of the raptors, and tracking and following the migrants who are in the desert now, crossing the desert, which has been weaponized essentially against them as far as crossing goes. And then, of course, you have the coyote on the far right with the gun. Also, human predation, as it were, on the migrants. And what you see is a really increasing level of violence and the possibility of death as the 20th century bleeds into the 21st.
And I think if you look at it as a whole, at the very bottom and front of the picture plane, you have so many things that are both man-made, as in the spiral wire, and then the cactus, which is both nurturing and deadly. And the landscape itself has become a predator. It is a hostile environment. And if you look at the woman who is screaming and running and being chased by some kind of dog or coyote in the animal sense of it, her hands are splayed and she is screaming. And that reminds me of the splayed hands and the screaming of the baby in the otherwise very quiet border crossing of the sculpture. And you see themes that he repeats throughout, but this is now This is New Mexico, this is Arizona, this is not Texas in this depiction. And entirely the border has become weaponized. And people have, this to me is symbolic of, it is localized here. It is the Southwest depiction of border crossers and the weaponization of the border. But we now, in the 21st century, have so many refugees who are crossing borders throughout the world that this serves to me as a metaphor for a global phenomenon and the hostility toward refugees globally, and what they are willing to risk in order to leave their homes and find a life for themselves and for their children. And it's a horrific price that they pay. And this is a very compelling image. It is fairly large, 50 inches by 25. And the sculpture on the left can give you comfort. This image, there is no comfort. There is no respite. There is no hope. And that speaks to our condition now, I believe.
So that as we see the close-up, you can see the body of a child in the desert, and I think this speaks to what Jimenez saw as the intensification of putting migrants in harm's ways through policies such as Operation Hold the Line in El Paso in the early 90s, and then Operation Gatekeeper in Southern California in the late 90s. And is essentially the regime of exclusion. Border policy has become one of total exclusion, not of regulation, as it had been for most of the 20th century, but of exclusion, and which is pretty much the regime I think we have today.
And this brought to mind, as we were preparing for this conversation, a poem by the Texas writer, Gloria Ansaldúa. To live in the borderlands means you. And this was from her landmark book, Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza. And she lived right on the border, and she's nothing if not a Tejana. And so we felt to include part of it. And this is the first stanza, and I would like to read it, and then the last very brief stanza to get a sense of the feeling of living in the borderlands, living on the border. To live in the borderlands means you are neither Hispana, India, Negra, Española, ni Gabacha, eres mestiza, mulata, half-breed, caught in the crossfire between camps while carrying all 5 races on your back, not knowing which side to turn to, run from. To survive in the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, be a crossroads. And I think Ansaldúa's sense of the borderlands in this particular poem and her idea of Nepantla, that liminal space, creates a very large territory in the borderlands that isn't just geographic. It is metaphorical, it is literary, it is psychological. It lives inside everyone who is part of this territory. As a literary person, John, what is your take on Ansaldúa's poem?
Well, Uh, I'm a native of the Lower Rio Grande Valley, of where Anzaldúa hails from as well, and certainly this speaks to the experience of the border that I know, and even though she expressed it way more eloquently than I could ever. So the question of it speaks to this idea in her other famous phrase, the border is una herida abierta, right? An open wound. And it because of the violence that has characterized its history, because of the kind of conflict that it has existed between indigenous people, Black people, Anglos, and of course Mexican folks, all of whom are not only making claims, but of course trying to negotiate kind of racial regimes of power in the borderlands. And so I think this really captures that the conflict that is characteristic of living there,
and of the conflict inside one trying to negotiate living there. I recommend that everyone who is watching this evening run out and find a copy of this and read the entirety of it. We have one more image we'd like to look at that is still based in the Southwest, in the border.
Holly, before we go to that, we have an interesting question from Janice Bergman Carton. So I'm going to read that. She says, I'm struck by the power of these monumental sculptures to resist easy consumption, to evade efforts to see them from a single viewing point. I wonder if any of you, including Florencia, have thoughts about what happens when these monumental sculptures, meant to be seen outdoors in public spaces, are brought indoors into a tame gallery space.
Holly, I don't know if you have a comment. I do, but I
certainly have a comment. I think I have seen his work indoors and outdoors over the decades. And I have to say that what happens when they are indoors, and particularly when the Albuquerque Museum had a retrospective of his work, which had over 300 pieces, what they do is they upset the interior space. It is no longer tame. They serve to activate it. They serve to discombobulate it. That being said, they also make you feel like being in that space is not large enough for them, and they want to knock the space down. I do believe that most of these pieces live their lives in the out of doors, and they come inside periodically, and then they go outside again. It's sort of like dogs for the Iditarod, who have to live outside in nature, but they do come in. They do come in, and they work better in the outside. I agree, John.
Absolutely, Holly, and thank you, Janice. That's a great question, and really, I think a case in point about that. I mean, yes, I think there is. I do think I agree with Holly that these sculptures can, in fact, be quite disruptive and activated even indoors. But on the other hand, there is a politics to their positioning, whether in a public space, in an outdoor space, as opposed to contained within a building, even if it's a public building. I think the case in point is what happened to the version of Border Crossing at UTSA, which had for a very long time been situated outdoors in a kind of central student union type space. But then was, kind of removed for kind of maintenance. Of course, these sculptures do need periodic maintenance because of exposure to the elements, but somehow it never managed, as far as I know, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, it never made its way back out to the public space, the outdoor public space. And that was seen by many at UTSA as well as a capitulation to the kind of anti-immigrant sentiment that has set in recent years. And so absolutely the public or open outdoor placement is absolutely political, and there is a sense that at times moving it indoors can be a containment strategy.
And for Luis, I think he saw his smaller work as collectible for private spaces, whether they be museums, interior spaces, or private homes. But he really wanted his monumental art to be outdoors where monumental art is supposed to be. And he has many different iterations of different things, such as the Fiesta Dancers, which, is a depiction of the Jarabe Tapatia, the what is called here, here meaning the United States, the Mexican hat dance. But you have this overly large drawing, which is in the exhibition. And then you have a version of the actual fiberglass sculpture, which I saw every day as I was going to work at UNM. It is outside the Center for the Arts. And it causes all sorts of responses. This really does take place in Hondo or Roswell. It is very Mexican. It is very New Mexican. It also focuses on, it combines a sense of Mexican ballet folklorico, but really honky-tonk kind of environment. And people are complain about the fact that these figures are ugly. The man has a panza, the woman has been around the block. They are not graceful. It is, to me, joyful and graceful and life affirming, and a monument to people such as ourselves, or everyday people who are having a very good time. And I think it speaks to, I've never seen this displayed indoors. It would make no sense being indoors. It is one of his most joyful pieces, which is a contrast to some of the other things that we've been looking at, and the stridency and the ambiguity of the other pieces. I don't think there's anything ambiguous about this, personally speaking.
Well, I think that's beautifully said, Holly, and I don't really have any anything else to add apart from this is a kind of hope to see it in person one day at UNM.
We'll invite you to UNM.
Okay. But
the one thing I wanted to add about displaying the sculptures indoors is that the sculptures also have an educational mission, and sometimes having the work inside the gallery allows us for certain opportunities to teach the students and to teach the public that comes to the museum. I mean, you could do that with the work outdoors too, but when you place the work indoors in conjunction with other pieces by the artist or other artists, you create a kind of a dialogue or the opportunity to create conversations between different works of art. So I think it serves a purpose for a while to have these pieces indoors. I could also add that there are editions, and they exist outdoors in many places, sometimes editions of 3 or 4 or 5. So you have the opportunity to see them in public outdoor places. John, you were going to say something, please do.
Oh, I'm quite happy to move on to our next part of the program.
I think we have, go ahead, Holly.
Are we drawing to a close? Do we have other things to do?
I think only some questions, Q&A.
Oh, that would be great.
If anyone wants to send their questions, that would be wonderful. We answered several of them. Somebody asked that there is an inscription at the base of Border Crossing, a special dedication that Luis Jimenez did to his father. And I'm sorry, I don't have the exact text of the inscription with me, but it is it's the title in English and in Spanish, and a dedication to his father by the artist. Well, I think we're drawing to a close. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation and for being part of our program. I really appreciate your participation.
Well, it was a pleasure. It's always a pleasure working with you, Flor. It's been a pleasure meeting you in this COVID era, John, the way we meet, and working with you, and to be able to work on Luis Jimenez again is a real privilege.
Well, and it was great working with you, Holly, on this and talking with you. And thank you to our audience and to the Blanton Museum of Art and to Flor for curating this exhibit and inviting us.
Thank you. So now I have a little text. This is it. This is it for tonight's conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Before we go, I'm gonna stop sharing our screen, and so here are a few quick reminders. We're shaking things up a bit in the new year and moving our curated conversations to a new day and time. We'll start on Wednesday, January the 26th at noon with Conversing with Prints, the making of Without Limits. Curators Christian Wurst and Jana Labraska will discuss the centrality of process in the exhibition Without Limits, Helen Frankenthaler Abstraction and the Language of Print, and highlight some of their favorite works. For details of how to watch past curated conversations, go to blantonmuseum.org/museum from home. If you would like to show your support, become a member today at blantonmuseum.org/membership. Sign up for our Blanton News at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe to always be in the know about what's happening at the museum. And finally, if you enjoyed tonight's event, please help us continue to bring quality programming to the community by making a donation to blantonmuseum.org/pay-what-you-wish. Thanks again, and we hope to see you for the next month's curated conversation on its new date and time.